Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here with Sandra Turner, who's an oceanographer from UC Riverside. And she's here, volunteered her time to be here with us today to answer our kids' questions. So thank you so much for joining us. Um, I'd like to just really quickly say that Green Kid Crafts, we're one of the leading providers of subscription boxes, science and crafts for kids. And this month's theme, one of the big themes we sent out was ocean science. So we have thousands of kids around the world who have been working on ocean science activities at home. Our box included this month all kinds of things. We had a coral reef painting project. We had a glow in the dark jellyfish project. I'm trying to think of the other ones. Anyways, there are 4 or 5 really interesting projects for kids, hands-on. And with that, as you know, with learning, with experimenting, come a lot of questions.
Of course, yeah.
So before I go into the questions, and we'll wait for folks to join in, could you introduce yourself and maybe share what got you into oceanography?
Sure. So thanks everyone for joining me. I hope I can share with you a little bit today about my passion for the oceans. I've loved the oceans since I was a very, very little kid. So I spent my summers growing up going to the beach in Avalon, New Jersey, which is a little barrier island off of the coast of New Jersey in the Atlantic Ocean. And from those days on, I loved the beach, I loved the ocean and everything to do with it. So I had a lot of great opportunities to get more and more interested and involved with topics about ocean sciences over the years. And ultimately, I decided to go to graduate school to study the oceans and how they're interacting with our planet's climate. And I did that at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which is in La Jolla, California, just north of San Diego. And I finished up that about, almost 10 years ago now. And I've been a scientist ever since. So right now, I'm a professor at the University of California at Riverside, and I teach lots of classes, but one of the things I teach is Introduction to Oceanography to about 500 students each year. So I've heard probably every question there is to hear about the oceans, and so I'm happy to answer them because I think a lot of people come up with some of the same questions, and it shows to me how universal an interest in the oceans is for people, and also how much there is that we really just don't know about the oceans, even
Yeah,
though most of our planet is oceans. So I'm happy to answer questions today.
that
I'm
is
happy to be here.
that's awesome. I'm so excited to have you, and also, I'm also really curious how many of these kids' questions are very similar to the ones you get in your
Yeah.
undergraduate class. So you'll have to be honest with us. All right,
Yes, no
so
problem.
I'm going to say a quick hello. Thank you, Heather, for joining us, who's just reminded us here that we had a cool ocean bottle experiment too. Thank you for reminding us of that, Heather. And let's just get started with some of these questions.
Sure.
So let's start with a question here from Ariel Gonzalez in Poncho. Why does the ocean make big waves? Mhm.
Oh, sure. So this is really interesting because there's a lot of different kinds of things that cause waves in the ocean, but most of the waves in the ocean are caused by wind, and every wave starts out really, really tiny. Imagine just like ripples in a pond. But if wind grows, if the wind keeps blowing for long enough and in the same direction, especially for a long time, those waves can just add up and become bigger and bigger and bigger until you get really, really large wind waves. So that's most of the waves in the ocean. There are other things that can cause really big waves in the oceans as well, though, and those are things like earthquakes. So you
Mhm.
might have heard of a kind of wave called a tsunami. And those are waves that happen when the actual seafloor itself raises and then lowers, and it generates massive waves that way that can be really destructive when they hit land. And the biggest wave of all is actually something that happens every single day, and those are waves that are called the tides. And those are caused mostly by the moon, but also by the sun and the gravity between the earth and the moon and the earth and the sun. So lots of different kinds of waves, but mostly the ones you're probably familiar with are from the wind.
Interesting. And the one's right behind me, by the way. I'm not really at the beach. I'm just using a virtual background before you get jealous. But thank you for that. I appreciate that answer. It's so complex, isn't it? And yeah, I think there's a natural draw to trying to understand waves when you see them. It's just so
Yeah.
kind of amazing when you think about it. Oh, great. Next question I have from, let's see, actually, we got this question twice. One One's from Jordan, 9 years old, and one's from Julie. Why are the oceans salty?
Yeah, this is a really good one too. So the first thing I like to tell everyone when they ask that question is really that there's many different kinds of salts in the oceans. Sometimes we think of just table salt, but actually there are many different kinds of salts. And all of those salts ultimately come from the solid earth. So they either come from rocks on land or they come from the sea floor, and are delivered to the oceans because superheated magma from inside the earth is rising and interacting with the rocks on the seafloor, and that's adding salt to the ocean as well. So ultimately, all of our salts come from the solid earth and are delivered into the water. And most of the salt is sodium chloride, so sodium and chloride that you find in normal table salt, but there are also things like magnesium and potassium and calcium carbonate, and sulfate, and these are other kinds of salts that we find in the oceans as well.
Awesome. That's yeah. It's not just table salt. So even though it tastes salty, doesn't it? Um, Great. Well, thank you. We had one of the experiments in our ocean boxes this month was about, or we talked about one of the themes was about pH, and we had a lot of questions about pH and about coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef. And I thought we would jump right in because we have a
Sure.
few, it's kind of a complex topic. I'm sure there's a few questions related. So maybe we could start with the pH. Why? Yeah, maybe you can think one step ahead
Yeah.
of me and no,
Yeah, so
start
pH
through that.
confuses people sometimes. It's just a way that we measure how acidic a substance is, right? And so we can say that something is an acid if it has a low pH, and something is a base if it has a high pH. And that kind of dividing line between an acid and a base on the pH scale is pH 7. And so the oceans actually have a pH of about 8, so they're considered a base. And so we were really worried, and we talk a lot about something called ocean acidification.
Mhm.
But we're actually still talking about the oceans being a base. We're not really concerned about the oceans becoming an acid. They're just becoming less basic, if you will. So their number on that pH scale is coming down. And that happens because the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere also controls how much carbon dioxide can be dissolved in the oceans, and that turns out to affect the pH of our oceans and how acidic it is. That all matters because a lot of different organisms that live in the oceans build skeletons, out of something called calcium carbonate, which is just like chalk. And if you could do this at home. Actually, I like to do it with like a Tums tablet or something that's made, like baking soda is made out of a really similar mineral. So it dissolves really easily in especially sort of mildly acidic water, or if you have like soda and you put a Tums in it, you'll see it start bubbling and fizzing.
Right.
And so you can imagine kind of the same thing is kind of going on with these animals in the ocean that have these skeletons that are made out of chalk. They're really sensitive to what the ocean's level of acid is. And so they can have a hard time forming those skeletons if the ocean pH changes. So that's kind of everything that's generally going on. And coral are an example of one of those animals in the oceans that builds these skeletons out of chalk.
Well, that's yeah. Thank you for that. And one of the questions we had that kind of leads into this is how do those get their shape, and how it's such an intricate shape if you've ever seen a piece of coral in the
Yeah.
ocean, and I'm pretty sure it's going to have to do with what you just talked about.
Exactly. So a lot of
Mhm.
people don't, well, so first of all, I think a lot of people don't realize that coral are animals, that they're not plants. But they're colonial animals. So there are lots of little individual animals all living together, and each little individual coral is called a polyp. But because they live in these colonies, they can make really large, massive shapes. And they're secreting the skeleton, just like like a snail shell or a clam shell. The coral animal is making this shell out of calcium carbonate. And so the animal itself is always living at the top, but through time they're building up this shell beneath them, and so they can form these really elaborate structures.
Mhm.
But those skeletons, just like your bones, are just plain white. So all of the beautiful color is actually coming from the tissue of the animal at the very end, and it's specifically coming from some little tiny microscopic plankton that are living in the tissues of the animal. And those are something called zooxanthellae. It's a very fun word, and they give the coral all of its beautiful colors. So the shape is coming from the skeleton and the colors are coming from these really tiny microscopic organisms living with the
Oh,
coral.
cool. We're gonna have to spell that out because I don't know how off
It's a
the top of
great,
my head, but
great
we'll do
word.
that in
Yeah.
a blog post afterwards for everyone.
Sure.
And and write this up, of course. We had another question coming in, so let me thank everyone who's joining us. We got Clover, Magnolia, Heather, Ariel, Wang. Everyone's watching right now. Hi, thank you guys for joining. And we have Hannah who just submitted a question about colors too, and the question is, why are oceans blue? So this is from Aria, who is 6. Mhm.
Yeah, great. So the oceans are blue because that's the color that gets reflected back out of white light, and all of the other colors get absorbed. So actually, I know that you guys just had a box about colors and rainbows
Mhm.
recently because my daughter got that box and did that. And so in that, she learned, like, if you have a prism, that you can separate white light into all of the colors of the rainbow, right? So white light is actually composed of all of these different colors. And it turns out that each of those colors have a different amount of energy. And so they might get absorbed or reflected back to you depending on what they're traveling through. And as white light from the sun enters into the ocean, we're absorbing all of the reds and yellows and blues, and only the blue light can travel further and get reflected back. And that's basically related to how much energy blue light has compared to the other colors. But yeah, so you see blue because that's what's getting reflected back.
Interesting. It seems like a simple question, Aria, but actually it is it's a lesson in physics and
Yeah,
refraction and all kinds of great stuff.
lots of stuff going on.
Awesome. All right, so we also have, let's see, we have an entire class here watching with her students at the Edlovich Jewish Community Center, Washington, D.C., and we got so many questions. We're going to do our
Oh,
best to
great.
answer them. And if we don't address them now, I'll just say that we'll follow up later with a blog
Sure.
post with more. So let's talk a little bit about animals in the ocean. This is endless fascination. I also have 2 boys. And can we talk a little bit about dolphins and sharks? And specifically, I've got 4 questions here that say, how do these animals how do they survive during hurricanes? What happens? There's no doctor in the ocean. What if they get hurt? So we have some of these very important questions, and maybe you can speak to what it's like to be in an ocean during these hurricanes or
Well,
other.
luckily, I've never been terribly close to a hurricane at sea, but I have been in some big storms. But I think one of the important things to remember is a lot of what we see in terms of these big storms is going on at the surface of the oceans. It's not actually influencing things very deep. And I think this is something that we can all kind of get a feel for. Like if you've ever been at the beach and you were trying to get out past the waves, right? If you're standing up and the wave hits you, you kind of fly all over the place. But if you dive beneath the wave, you don't really move around as much and you can get out past the wave break
Mhm.
much easier. And so what you're experiencing when you see that is how you lose the energy of the wave as you go deeper and deeper beneath the ocean surface. And so that's basically a way of saying is you could have crazy weather going on up at the surface, but if things are diving deeper down, they're not experiencing a lot of that same destructive
Turbulence
power,
or that
right?
same, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and so effectively, animals, organisms living in the ocean, they have to get out of the way. Just like you or I, if there's really bad weather, they can dive deep. They can
Mhm.
try to move to another location
Mhm.
if it was particularly bad for them. But most of the time, if they're just down a little bit deeper, they're not going to be experiencing the storm in any way that's harmful to them. So that would be my answer about about those.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. And yeah, I think there's definitely some safety down deep in the ocean. And that brings us to another question. We have Rowan, Zach, Jonathan joining us too. Why is the ocean so big and how deep is the ocean? And this is kind of a segue here. Mhm.
Oh, well, so the ocean covers about 70% of the surface of our planet. So most of the Earth is ocean. And basically, the oceans are just filling in all of the low areas on our planet's surface. Water does that. It just fills the shape of a container. So there's a lot of differences in the heights of land and ocean on our planet, and the water is just filling in all of the low levels. So kind of the sea level and how much of our planet is covered by ocean depends on how much water we have on
Mhm.
the ocean on the planet. So in terms of depths, though, this is where it gets really kind of fun. On average, so the average depth of the ocean is about 2.5 miles deep, very, very deep,
It's really deep.
right? And the deepest spots on the ocean are taller or deeper, sorry, than the tallest spots on land. So the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean is deeper than Mount Everest is high. And so that's very, very deep. And so that's almost 12 miles deep. So very extremely deep depths. So most of the ocean floor we've never observed, not directly, and not even indirectly. And so it really truly is still a frontier.
Completely. And unexplored. My kids are into octonauts. I don't know if you have ever watched the show, but we know all about the
Yeah,
Mariana Trench
yeah,
here at
great.
home.
Yeah.
One of the questions here from Gabriel, who was Dave Moppert's a child, is more personal. It's, what is the deepest you've been in an ocean, or scuba
Oh, well,
dived, or other? I'll make that a little bit more general. Mhm.
sure. So I've never been lucky enough to go down in any kind of a submersible that would let me go very deep. So I've gone diving, but not particularly deep dives. So I think, well, oh man, I'm never really been more than about, I guess, 25, 30 feet deep in, personally scuba diving. I scuba dive more for fun. My research involves indirect ways of getting down to the ocean. And so usually actually what I would say I do to get to the deep sea is use a massive drill ship. And I have sailed on expeditions where we actually build a giant pipe to get down to the seafloor so that we can sample the ocean floor that way. And we need to have literally miles worth of pipe on the deck of that ship in order to be able to
Yeah,
reach the seafloor at these really extreme deep locations.
I mean, that's amazing. And one of the topics that came up when we were talking about this event, or you volunteered, which again, thank you so much, it's
Oh,
so
no
kind of you,
problem.
was about microscopic fossils. And you had a line that said that you study microscopic fossils, and how the ocean and how the world came to be. And I
Yeah,
just thought that was so fascinating. And now that you're talking about the deep sea, could you speak to that? That's kind of hard
sure.
for me to wrap my head around, so I imagine for others as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this always gets to, I love to ask people, kids, but not only kids, adults too, like, what do you think is on the ocean floor? And that's always a really fun question. And sometimes people go, sand, maybe. But
Yeah.
actually, most of the ocean floor is covered in the remains of very, very tiny plankton.
Interesting.
So most of we call it the sediment on the seafloor, is actually fossils. They're fossilized remains of these plankton that formed shells when they were alive. So just like calcium carbonate shells are made by coral, calcium carbonate shells are also made by microscopic plankton. And there's a couple different kinds. There are plankton called coccolithophores. There are some slightly larger zooplankton called foraminifera. And then there are also plankton that form shells out of glass, which is absolutely beautiful too. There are things called diatoms and radiolarians, and all of these little teeny tiny organisms. When they die, their shells ultimately sink to the seafloor, and that makes up the sediments.
Mhm.
Um, so that's really neat. And those animals and organisms are the base of our food chain. So all of the fish and mammals, living in the ocean ultimately depend on those guys. But they're also really important because they can preserve in their shells information about the ocean and the planet in general, at the time when they were alive.
Mhm.
And so when scientists like me go back and we try to pick up these shells from the seafloor, we can, study those shells to learn about the oceans in the past, like what the temperature of the oceans was and how it changed through time, how the chemistry of the oceans changed through time. We
Mhm.
can learn about things like the ocean pH and if it was
Right.
different compared to today. And so all of that is really important for us understanding
Yeah.
the evolution of our planet.
That is so interesting. And one of the questions that came up was about the Great Barrier Reef and why it's shrinking. So this is from Nate, who is 6.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if Nate is online today, but is probably related to this. Could you speak to that specifically a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, reefs in particular are experiencing a lot of different threats. They're kind of like canaries in the coal mine, if you've ever heard that expression, because they're really, really sensitive ecosystems. So
Hmm.
they're sensitive to changes in the temperature of the water. They're sensitive to changes in the chemistry of the water, that aspect of
Hmm.
how acidic the oceans are. They're also sensitive to just how much material is suspended in the ocean, because those tiny plankton that I mentioned before that live in the corals' bodies, they need sunlight in order to
Hmm.
survive. And so if the water has a lot of sediment floating in it, that's bad for the reef as well.
Hmm.
And they're also really sensitive to the other changes in the ecosystem, because like if a reef gets overfished, so if we remove a lot of the big fish that typically eat the algae off the reef and keep it from kind of smothering the corals, that can be a problem too. So unfortunately, that means that coral reefs today are getting hit by all of these different things. Global warming
Hmm.
and the raise in temperatures is a problem for them. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has an impact then on the acidity of the oceans, that's bad for the coral. So is overfishing, and so is runoff from land and pollution that directly comes from the land surface out to reefs. And unfortunately, many reefs are, of course, in shallow ocean areas near to land, and so
Hmm.
they're really kind of impacted then by what's going on nearby. So
Yeah.
all of those things are having a big impact on the health of coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef as well. Um, and so
Yeah.
you might have heard about things about called coral bleaching events,
Yeah.
where the coral turns all white. And again, that's not because the coral is dead. What it's doing is for we're not even entirely sure exactly why, but when temperatures get high, the coral tend to expel those little plankton that live in their tissues.
Mhm.
And so then they lose that color, but they also then lose a food source, because those plankton are helping provide the coral with food. And so many of the corals that bleach do ultimately die, even though when they're bleached, it doesn't necessarily mean they're dead. They could come back from that. But we hear a lot about different bleaching events happening in the Great Barrier
Yeah.
Reef, and those are often associated with really warm water
Yeah.
temperatures.
That's so interesting. We'll have to share some more resources on this. I feel like there's a lot of questions coming in to just,
Yeah,
keep understanding and what's going
for
on.
sure.
And I think it sounds. I mean, it's so complex. There's so many interconnected pieces, and
Yeah.
it's really inspiring to see all these kids interested in oceans. And I'm hoping we get some oceanographers, more
Oh, yeah.
oceanographers in the world to help us combat that. I do think there's hope for, when we see the interest of the next generation in these
Yeah.
topics. It inspires me. So I have another question that just came in right now from Oliver. It looks like Oliver, age 7. Thank you for being here and watching us. How much pollution is in the ocean? So I know that's a big number, but the ocean is so big. You've told us that, or we know
Sure.
that. And we have how much pollution is in the ocean, and how do you even estimate things like how many animals are in the ocean? Like, how can you wrap your head around these things? And maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. So we do observing the oceans comes in so many different forms, right? And so we take samples of the ocean water, to measure things like different kinds of pollution in the water. We take samples of sediments all over the oceans. We have instruments that are always going around the oceans trying to study them and send us data. And we also take measurements from space using satellites, right? So there's lots of different ways that we observe the oceans, and we can look at that way at many different kinds of pollution, because there's not just like sort of one specific thing. Something you might have heard about a lot recently is plastic in the ocean.
Mhm.
And we're only really just starting to learn and be able to get a grasp on that. We don't really have a great handle on that, right? We make estimates based on taking samples from a few different locations, and then we can try to sort of like ramp that up, or we say scale that up and
Mhm.
say, okay, if everywhere has the kind of a relative amount of plastic that we found in these samples, then this is what that says about
Right.
how much there is in the oceans as a whole. um, but the more studying we do, the more observations and samples and things like that we get, the better that we can really understand these
Mhm.
problems. And so, there's differences in the extent of pollution from plastic than there are from other kinds of chemicals. Like, we can even trace things in the oceans like lead from gasoline that was really widespread in the US in the middle of the last century, but's been phased out. And so
Mhm.
we can see how that's helped the accumulation of lead in the ocean. But
Mhm.
there's lots of different kinds of pollutants that
Mhm.
we have to monitor
Yeah.
that way. So
So that's a big question,
yeah.
Oliver, and it sounds like you could probably spend a year trying to come up with an estimate.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I think the one thing I would say is that it's pretty remarkable how we have found evidence for humans' influence on the oceans everywhere we've looked. In the deepest ocean, up near the poles, up in the Arctic Ocean, down near Antarctica, in some of the most pristine ocean environments, we still find, unfortunately, evidence of human pollution in different forms. So
yeah. So we've got a couple minutes left, and we have a couple really cool questions I want to make sure we
yeah,
get
great.
to, mainly about animals. So this
Sure.
is one from Nathaniel, age 7. Could a megalodon still exist in the deep ocean? And I had to even ask what a megalodon was. So
Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, so I get these kinds of questions a lot about like, how do we, if the oceans are so big, so vast, do we even really know what could still be around? Um, but if you actually look at where in the oceans most things live, it's a very, very small amount of the oceans as a whole. And that's because most of the oceans are just too dark um, in order to support life, right? There are some organisms that live in the deep sea in total darkness. They're very unusual. They have adapted very, very weird ways to live. But when we think about most of like the animals that we associate with the oceans, the sharks, the whales, the dolphins, all of those guys, they're really living in a very restricted amount of the oceans. They're not living in super, super deep areas. And the megalodon was a giant, giant shark, bigger than the great white today. It is extremely unlikely, right? We can say pretty much in all certainty that there isn't a place where that shark could be in the oceans today with us not knowing it. Again, because even though the oceans are huge, the places where organisms like that can survive are restricted.
Mhm.
Also, we have good fossil records of these kinds of organisms, and we could see their fossils, and we find them regularly, and then they disappear. And so we know that megalodon went extinct about 2.5 million years ago, and it's not been around since. But there have been many, many really giant, incredible marine organisms that have lived in the oceans through time that are not around any longer. There were many really remarkable animals that lived at the time of the dinosaurs in the oceans as well, that we of course don't have today.
So fascinating. So I just Googled it while we were on here to get a sense of the size. It looks like 50 feet, and we've kind of extrapolated that based on teeth
Yeah,
records. So
yes,
who
that's
knows? Maybe maybe bigger, right? It's crazy. So thank you for that. And we had another question from Jaden, who joined us here today, about
yeah.
specifically about the pressures. And this, I've seen this question a lot, is um, there are fish that live at super deep,
Mhm.
parts of the ocean, and we know that the pressure is so intense. How can they even have gotten down there if the pressure is so crushing? Like, how is this even possible?
Yeah, well, they have to adapt to it, right? So, I mean, it's over many generations. You have organisms that evolve the ability to live in these kinds of extreme conditions. Certainly, you couldn't take one specific animal today that lives in the shallow part of the ocean and move it down to the deep sea. It would be, it would be killed by those pressures just like we would, right? But the organisms that are adapted to live down at those pressures, they have ways of dealing with those kinds of different conditions. Um, and if they were changed and brought up to the surface, they would have problems then because they're not adapted to the low pressure environment that other
Mhm.
organisms are used to. So it's really all about what a particular animal it has evolved to be able to tolerate. And there are many, many different kinds of environments in the oceans. And so we find very different organisms present at these different types of environments, not just based on the pressure, but also the availability of light, the availability of food,
Mhm.
and these sorts of other things as well, temperatures. Yeah,
So fascinating. All right, we're going to have to wrap up here, but I've got
no
two,
problem.
1.5 more questions for you on this theme. So, what is the deadliest and or coolest sea creature that you know about?
Okay, so I'm going to give the non-surprising or the surprising answers for the non-obvious answers for both of these, and but I'll make them sort of separate.
Okay.
I think, but in both cases, I'm going to pick microscopic things, which
Okay.
maybe is not obvious. But for the deadliest, I would say that there are what we call harmful algal blooms, and these are either caused usually by a type of plankton called a dinoflagellate. Or sometimes caused by bacteria that live in the ocean. But they can release really deadly toxins that are deadly to marine life. They're deadly to people. If you're near a bloom and you inhale this sort of thing, they can cause really bad asthma attacks. If you eat shellfish like oysters or clams that grew when there was a harmful algal bloom going on, that could make you really sick. And so I think that those are the most dangerous, not
Mhm.
individual animals, but these microscopic things. But
Mhm.
when they bloom in massive numbers, can produce chemicals that are really, really harmful for everybody. So that
Interesting.
to me is the most dangerous marine creature. And for the coolest, oh gosh, I also have to say, so my favorite is an organism called the foraminifera, and they're these microscopic organisms that make these shells out of chalk that make all these sediments that we find on the seafloor. And I just think that they're so cool because the shapes of their skeletons, when you look at them under a microscope, are absolutely remarkable. They come in all of these possible shapes, from little spirals to some of them um, like have all kinds of just really remarkable details. But also because they're everywhere, and yet you don't even really know about them, right? I think it's just that's sort of remarkable. But that's the case with a lot of things in the ocean. Like, a lot of people don't realize that just as much photosynthesis, which is responsible for all of your oxygen that you breathe, right? Just as much goes on in the oceans as it does on land from trees. And so every other breath you take, oceanographers like to say, is thanks to the ocean and not thanks to the land. And that's really kind of important. And that happens, and you can't ever even see them, right? You don't see the organisms that are producing that oxygen from the ocean the way that we see the trees on land. So
That's
I think that's pretty
awesome.
cool.
That's so cool. Thank you. We're gonna have to both, come up with some kind of art project with these foraminifer. Probably saying it wrong, but these
No, it's
these
okay.
animals. And share it with everyone, because I just looked at some pictures and they're just beautiful. And
Very beautiful.
I love that you took the time and you told us the non-traditional answers. And I hope everybody joining us today enjoyed this and learned something and was inspired to look at the ocean a little bit differently next time you do, next time you
Yeah.
have the opportunity. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you
Oh,
everyone
no
for
problem.
signing in, and have a great rest of your day, Sandra. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.